My name is Judy Dempsey, and I'm moderating a stellar panel. It's very small, as you can see, but we'll do our best. This is the first thing. Secondly, and much more importantly, it's a great honor to be back in Belgrade. I was here 3 weeks ago, but every time I land, I'm always reminded how the past is not that distant. So this is what this discussion actually is about. I'm not going to introduce the panel because it would take half an hour. It's all in your bio collections. You can see how famous they are, and they come from Turkey and from Greece and from Albania and from Croatia and from Serbia and from Britain, Greece and from Poland, the EU institutions. So welcome everybody. It's great to have you. We have a very ambitious, and I hope it won't end up to be too pessimistic, we have a very ambitious topic, and it's called Addressing Political Instability and Weak Institutions in Southeast Europe. And you heard the Prime Ministers of Serbia touch on this morning, and the Prime Minister of Albania. It was a very lively discussion, and I hope we can replicate some of the liveliness. I want to immediately start with, I think I'll start with Remzi A for Albania. Okay, Remzi, I'm going to start off with you. You've had a huge background in the media, in dealing with civil society, with institutions. And what I would like to ask you is, I don't mean to make it so complicated, but is one of the great weaknesses of the Western Balkans, is it the weakness of its institutions? And you don't have to talk for long, because you'll be cut off long.
In the Balkans, it's evident, and what I think it's clear for the moment is that we see a liberal moment in Central Europe, and we see a liberal advancement in the Balkans. Or we have reverse transitions in Central Europe, and I think we have frozen transition in the Balkans. What I'm concerned is that this is the 6th forum, and sometimes I feel that we repeat the same things. And it's not because we are wrong, but because things are not changing or changing in the wrong direction, and I call it the tyranny of the status quo. So we have a very long-term status quo in the Balkans, and I think this is problematic. What we see with the institutions, the first problem is trust. Very low trust on institutions. 96% of Albanians believe in the European Union and NATO, and only 15% of the Albanians have trust on Albanian political parties. There is a clear gap between the political elite and the publics. Second problem,
Even in Albania?
yeah, I'm mentioning Albania. Yeah. So the trust on local institutions, in justice system, it's extremely low. In political parties, it's extremely low. Second is the question of the choice. I think the choice today in the Balkans is between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. The public is becoming cynical towards political parties. They think they are the same. They go to elections and they do rotations of power, but they don't have hope that things are going to change. And as Ivan Krastev used to say, people, instead of going to the street, are going to the airports. And this is also the case of a lot of Albanians who simply find a way to go to Germany because they lost hope in our system. The paradox is that in Albania, if you see polls, Albanians has a very high trust on democratic system, and a very low trust on democratic institutions. Because the model actually is weak institution and strong personalities. And the last point, I think we thought that we were building consensual democracies, and in paper we have consensual democracies, but in practice we have majoritarian democracies. So, and we have a domination, as I said, of strong personalities who prevail over the weak institutions. This is just opening. And
Thank you, Ramzi. We can go back to these very important points in a few minutes. I want to turn to Greece. And even before the euro crisis, your institutions were questionable, some of them. I mean, it was a very special kind of political system that prevailed since the junta was kicked out and since Greece joined the EU. With the euro crisis, and the very deep economic crisis your country is going through, how is it affecting the institutions? Is it weakening them or is it changing them?
It's actually doing both, and I think it's a fair question of whether we have weathered the storm, because you have a twin crisis, economic and migration, both of them still evolving, and it's difficult to make any forecast, but I think it's fair to say that although institutions and Greek society have been severely tested, neither has collapsed, although we came close to some kind of breaking point. But they have been affected. There are scars left behind. You look at the economic institutions trying to do two things at the same time, implement the austerity measures, but also restart the economy. And the performance, unfortunately, has not been stellar so far. Social institutions, they're struggling because migration has added a great burden to the country. Public order, it's also a very difficult situation. You have the usual criminality, but also all the associated problems with the migration crisis, and so many people being trapped in the country, not knowing what to expect, what will happen to them. They're beginning to react. It's not easy to control them, and no one wants to use violence against those poor people. And then you look at the political dialogue, which leaves much to be desired, although I must say it's better than the US presidential debates, and I don't want to use the words used by Mr. Lavrov in the CNN interview. But on the positive side, I would say, Greeks are still overwhelmingly pro-EU, despite the skepticism and the pain. Maybe there's an element of masochism there, but we still want to stay in the euro. And also, Golden Dawn is still in single digits, which I think is important. That might change if unemployment remains at such high levels, and if we have a collapse of the agreement with Turkey and the numbers begin to increase again. And I think there's also the Marine Le Pen element there. They still have the first generation of rather primitive leadership. Now, if that changes, their appeal in society may change as well, but so far, single digits, it's better than many other European societies.
Thomas, on this, your neighbour may have to deal with a difficult question. I mean, interestingly, in Greece, support for the EU is strong, which may impact on the institutions. I mean, given the Brexit debate, it's a very difficult question, but how will this affect the institutions?
You know, it's incredibly difficult for many Brits. I think you've seen that earlier today with one of the earlier speakers who it's very difficult as a Brit to be able to go abroad and sort of talk now, and I feel it here. I'm acutely aware of it when I come back here to the Balkans and talk about institutions, talk about the need for the region to pursue EU membership, and then see that everything that's going on in my own country. You know, I've never hidden it. I'm very open. I was a passionate Remain supporter. I still believe that Britain's future should be in the European Union. I have to accept that we're going down a very different path. And I think it's a very disturbing path for Britain. I think in the immediate aftermath of the vote, there was a real sense that potentially something could be saved, that some sort of associate membership might be on the cards, which, interestingly enough, was talked about as a potential model for countries such as Ukraine and Turkey. Big outlying countries which wanted some sort of relationship with the European Union and bring it in closer, and that seems to be sadly disappearing. And I think this is very disturbing, and taken with the way that we are seeing now a very popularist agenda that's emerging in Britain. And we have to understand what the wider causes of this were, of course, but to see what's happening, to see the level of hatred that's now been directed towards people on the streets, to see that we have a government that is now very sincerely talking about a complete disengagement from the European Union. This is not an associate membership. This is nothing like it. It's actually cutting off. We might as well be Peru, frankly, for the way that some of these people are talking. And that I find very, very disturbing for the institutions. And obviously when you come here, as being British, trying to then talk up the value of the European Union, it's a very hard task. It's a hard task for me, but I really feel it for the British officials in the region who have done wonderful work and now finding a very difficult environment.
And indeed, given that we're in the Western Balkans, Britain is very important, and they've supported the German initiatives in the Western Balkans. Sinan, James touched on the institutions and how they might be affected, but also the role, Britain's future relationship, if any, with the EU. But, I mean, you're from Turkey. I mean, you see the problem now in Turkey. Given the immensely complex situation there, how are the institutions being affected now in Turkey?
What problem?
I was hoping you would ask that.
Let me start with that. No, all jokes aside, if I had 30 minutes to talk to you about institutions, I would entitle this The Great Unlearning. Now, I don't have 30 minutes, Judy, so don't worry. I know that I don't have 30 minutes. But I would still want to talk about the Great Unlearning, because when we talk about institutions, we learn something over the past 30 years, really. We learn that institutions matter. We learn that through institutions, we can reach the type of liberal democracy that we cherish. We can also set the path towards a stronger and sustainable growth. So in many ways, we now know that institutions matter in this respect. So the question to me, and I'll have two questions really, is why is it that our own societies, whether we are in the Western Balkans or in the Balkans generally, do not generate the type of dynamics that strengthen institutions? If that is indeed the goal that we have learned and that we have experienced occasionally in our own geography, why is it that this does not become a sustainable phenomenon? Now, one question is the question of this panel about weak institutions. But I have another question, and that's even more insidious. How is it that in countries like mine, where we've already built a certain institutional rule, and you know, the past 10 years were actually quite good in terms of institution building, how is it that we come to a point where we start to unravel that performance? That to me is a key question, and I think we should really concentrate more on this to understand, you know, where we have failed, where the West has failed, where our own engagement as civil society actors have failed, because there is something very worrisome going on here.
But this is a very important point. The first issue you raised, the dynamics. Where are the dynamics there to strengthen the institutions? Can I ask a leader from Serbia to, well, you're based in Berlin now, but I mean, the dynamics aside, why, especially in Serbia now, we have problems with the media, we have problems with the relationship between the civil society and the elites. Why are the institutions weak here, or are they weak in Serbia?
I think throughout the region they're weak, but this is not only Western Balkans phenomena. There are several elements to this, I would say. First one has a great deal to do with visionary leadership of the institutions, because institutions are not just institutions, they're also led by people. And there is a set of incentives and, if you will, motivation that has to be within these institutions in order to deliver, to provide for citizens. There's also something which we could call social credibility, reputation of these institutions. We don't trust, as Ramsey said, we don't trust our institutions, which is quite worrying. And then, of course, there is a fine set of structures, systemic structures, rules, procedures, overarching mechanism that actually controls these institutions. And I would say independent overarching systems that actually controls these institutions in order for them to be credible enough and efficient enough in provisions. And there is something, when it comes to the Western Balkans, there is something very, very special, I would say. In many of our countries, creating institutions was a symbiotic parallel effort by the international community and domestic efforts. And sometimes this has got messed up in the process, because it didn't really deliver what it was supposed to deliver. So this is one particularity, I would say, of the Western Balkans.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. This not delivering, but Croatia is now in the EU, and it has its ups and downs inside the EU. We've seen the recent election. We've seen elements still of weak institutions dealing with corruption. Jacques, how do you see it? How do you see this interplay of the political system in Croatia with the institutions? Are they strong enough now, or would you agree with Sinan that the dynamics aren't there to strengthen them?
Well, I would say, thanks God for the weak institutions. That's our only chance. Whenever the institutions were strong, the people were slaves. That's the experience, historical experience of the Balkans. And this is why chaos, which we are facing now, is much lesser evil than Milosevic or Tudjman, for instance, when institutions were quite strong. Or, in other words, waiting for European Union makes it a kind of paradise. In words of the today's Nobel Prize winner for literature, Mr. Zimmerman, or another word is much better known, I think, Bob Dylan, that big dark cloud is coming down. I feel I'm knocking on the heaven's door. When the door opens, it's not so nice. This heaven is, or called European Union, didn't make us better or wiser or whatever. So it means the institutions are not solving the problem. In a very simple, pragmatic terms, we have had 3 months of day after day hate speech between Zagreb and Belgrade. And there was practically no incidents between the people of two countries, thanks to the fact that people do not trust the institutions. 25 years ago, they trusted almost the same words and started killing each other. Or in Macedonia, you had 20 years of hate speech between Albanian minority representatives and Macedonian majority representatives. When the flood and earthquake came, suddenly everyone was shocked that Albanians are ready to help the Macedonian neighbors and vice versa, because they don't trust the institutions. Just as one sentence.
Yeah.
There is a kind of metaphysics of stability here. We do not need stability, and therefore we do not need strong institutions. We need change, and change is possible only when political institutions are weak. That's it.
Well, you see, the Ukrainians would actually argue the contrary, that what is needed is strong institutions, independent institutions, such as the judiciary, the chief prosecutor's office, and strong institutions to protect the rule of law.
And they would have cream.
No.
No.
No, they're not asking for cream. But we can go back to this.
But that's what they are talking about.
Well,
It's Crimea.
No, we're not talking about Crimea. It's a different issue, but we can go back to this later. We're talking about the oligarchs and corruption. Maciej, I mean, you've heard them all now, all the different views of weak institutions, as Shauka says, are good. We've got the problems, what has happened in the institutions, not sufficient dynamics to strengthen them. How do you see from your perspective in the EU, are the institutions becoming weaker in the Western Balkans? What do you see when you take this, when you have a sense of distance?
Look, I was also going to quote Dylan, but you stole my line, not least because he's an institution. But institutions have to grow. They have to be built and cherished. It takes time. And of course, we believe that, that institutions are an anchor of stability. And you could say this is Brussels speak coming from a Brussels bureaucrat. But actually, there are a lot of smart people who believe in that. I mean, Francis Fukuyama, in the second part of his History of Political Order, he put it in a historical perspective, showing how states consolidated around stable institutions, whether it was the Prussian army or in the United States, even the forestry administration. But that requires a constant effort, because institutions can bring predictability and also continuity of service. Of course, trust has to grow as well, and I take the point about the gap, and it's a paradox in a way that in order to hear a good story about European institutions, you have to go to Tirana today. So it's very telling about the state of affairs in Europe. But we believe in that kind of investment, because we're also acting when we're negotiating with the countries in the Western Balkans We also acting out of our enlightened self-interest. Whether we talk about managing of migration crisis, organized crime, or more recently radicalization, you need border guard, you need police, you need judiciary, you need even sanitary administration to run it. So that has to be strengthened. That's why we put so much emphasis on judiciary and the rule of law. I mean, the famous chapters 23 and 24, the progress on which holds the key to the heaven's door.
Sinan, would you like to come in here? I've got a problem with these institutions because when I was in Belgrade a couple of weeks ago, there was such a sense of frustration from particularly young people who were even who felt that the institutions were too distant or else corrupt or else in the hands of the oligarch, that civil society was being ignored. See, maybe Adelaide, you pick up this later, but Sinan, you wanted to come in here about the idea of the dynamics perhaps of the institutions.
Yes, I think to me, when I start to look at what's happening at the institution level, whether it is a failure to strengthen institutions or worse, the unraveling of institutions, the next question that I start to think about, where does this end? So you have, a political project that essentially rests on the weakening of institutions. Now, what is the, how do you sort of stave off that political project? How do you fight against it? Now, when you look around the world, the countries that have been able to establish this type of institutionless governance are countries that essentially have a political economy based on commodities, right? Essentially the Gulf countries, a bit Russia, and so on. Now, for the other countries, which, in the Balkans, we're not a political economy that tends to generate large amounts of oil and gas. Therefore, at some point, there will be a clash between economic realities and these political projects. This is something that we're starting to see already in Hungary. And my argument is that at some point, this type of, political institutionless political project is going to clash with the economic realities. The sooner that time comes, the sooner we will be equipped to redress the situation in this part of the world.
To come in here.
I would like to add is that the key problem I see for the institutions in our part of the world and in my country is the functionality. We have all the ingredients of a democratic system in Albania or in most of the Balkan countries. The question is how they are functioning. And we thought that we were building non-partisan independent institutions, and we ended building bipartisan politicized institutions. Basically, political parties, their philosophy is just sharing the cake. We have seen it also during the process of justice reform in Albania. We need non-partisan institutions. We have bipartisan institutions. Bipartisan institutions can function in advanced democracies where you have a level of trust and not the extreme mistrust we have in our societies. And basically what we see in the institutions, starting from, let's say, it's important but not the most important, media regulatory agencies. They are basically hostage of the political parties who share the cake. Because in order to function, a bipartisan institution needs a moderate consensus. In our case, we have an extreme mistrust. Basically, parties simply block each other, and the institutions are dysfunctional. And somehow, we become dysfunctional democracies. All the ingredients of the systems are there. The question how they function is very serious, how they correlate is very serious. And also, I think it's important to talk also for not only what kind of democracy we are building, but also what kind of capitalism we are building, because we have also dysfunctional market systems in our countries, and I think this is equally important.
Matthew, do you want to come in quickly here?
Just a brief comment. I mean, it's people who make the institutions. Huh? So you also have to invest in that change of mindset of people, meaning, for example, creating a functioning, a responsible civil service. It's not easy. I mean, I've had my own experience. I passed the first ever entry exam to the Polish civil service in 2000 it was, I think. And it gave me a certain sense of responsibility. It will not happen overnight, but it's badly necessary.
It's a very important point, because when Fidesz came in 2010, in fact, Fidesz did negotiate part of the EU negotiations, but then another team came in, and despite all the experience, they were sacked in 2010. So there must be continuity in civil service, which builds a kind of trust as well. James, you wanted to come in here.
I think it was this point that was raised earlier, just now, about state-owned enterprises. I mean, people often ask me, you know, what would be, if there was one thing I could immediately change. I mean, here in Serbia, and I think, you know, it extends across the region, it's this ridiculous idea of these state-owned enterprises where politicians spend months fighting out how to form governments, because they want to know where they can put their officials into these enterprises, which are incredibly inefficient, that have cost the country absolute fortunes to be badly managed, badly run, so these parties continue to have patronage. Yes. I mean, it is really shocking. As I say, it's the one thing that every time, without a doubt in my mind, if there's one thing that I could say, look, get rid of, you need to sort this out, this has got to be it first and foremost.
Problem in Hungary, in Serbia, with this interplay between the elites, and I'd be very careful how you use it, the domestic oligarchs and the state enterprises?
This is exactly what I was, you have previously mentioned it, also where the frustration comes from, because it's a matter of how we perceive these institutions, whether they're political enterprises or they're actually an institution that should provide for citizens. And this is the failure point, because they fail to provide for citizens. And I think it's just going on for too long, in a sense that we have lost our own track. We have no assessment criteria based on which we're going to assess them, whether they're actually doing something for us or not. I mean, take judiciary, take police. Everyone in the region, and I would say even for Iran, is frustrated with how this operates, and actually out of normative level, but really on the ground. And this is the key thing where we should, maybe as a civil society, but also as an audience, as citizens, we should try to put them in different baskets, political versus something that is actual on the ground.
Just one thing, Sina, Sharko has been waiting patiently.
Two things. I fail to see how can someone believe that economy is real while politics is not. In everyday life of millions of people, politics is as real as the economy is. So it's not something surrealistic outside of economy. It's part of the everyday life. It's as real as economy. And second point, the key question of this whole discussion is, can democracy survive the world disorder? In my understanding, the real question should be, can the world order survive because hundreds of millions of people were killed in the past 35 years, dozens of millions, sorry, in order to introduce democracy. And it's a given, we need democracy to be a kind of solution. But at the very beginning, with Thomas Hobbes and so on, the first need was security. And democracy failed to provide this in all these countries. Since South Africa, and post-communist world, and Arab, and Iraq, Afghanistan, and then Arabic countries.
Thanks. It's a very important point, providing security for us. Sinan, and then Tanos.
I feel that the discussion has been a bit introverted, namely we sort of criticizing ourselves, rightly so surely, for the lack of proper institutions. But I really want to bring another dimension, and which is, what is the role of external actors here in the institution building game? Because at least our recent democratic path has demonstrated that there is a role for external actors in building up the institutions. That is, there's a role for the EU, there is a role for international financial institutions, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank. But at this point, I think it is fair to say that the unease and the difficulties that the EU itself is experiencing within its own is having an inimical impact on our own ability to use the EU and other potential actors as leverage in rebuilding and strengthening our own institutions. So yes, there's a lot that we can do domestically, But even the external environment today has become much more difficult.
Yes, and the external environment, even if it's more difficult, the external actors are criticised too. And you will see this particularly in some countries in Central Europe. Tannis, and then James.
Just to follow on Sinan's comments, I think the glass is not half empty, it's half full. We have institutions in place. They're not perfect, but that's the idea of gradual evolution. And external actors are, of course, important. I would like to introduce the concept of enlargement. Not as a cure for everything. We need to do our homework as well. But I think enlargement can play a role. And then you have, after Brexit, I think you have two opposing trends. One who says, well, we have enough problems, no enlargement for another few years. And the other trend, of course, is, well, but this is doable first because of small size. And B, we need success stories. So I think enlargement, and one needs to differentiate between desirable enlargement, maybe Ukraine is desirable, Turkey would be desirable, but the other concept is feasible enlargement. So Western Balkans are feasible because of size. It will take commitment on the size of EU institutions, but also some member states will have to push harder for that. And you also need a lot of goodwill to resolve differences. And you need leadership which will not be looking at short-term political benefit, but at the long-term interest of their own countries. And that goes for countries both outside the EU and inside the EU.
It's an important point. James and then Maciek.
I think I'm reminded of a conversation I had last week with an official from Germany who, and we were sort of talking about the situation in Macedonia, and we know that that is a terrible situation that's emerged. I mean, democracy is in a very, very bad way there, and there does seem to be this sense amongst many people that maybe the problem is that too much emphasis has been put on outsiders, and outsiders just can't deal with this problem, because I think there's a difficulty of a mindset that exists. And we were saying, look, every time it looks like the situation is going to, is boil over, and maybe that's what the country needs, outside policymakers step in to dampen down the flames. And I think that you have to bear in mind that when there's very few people who follow the countries of the Western Balkans outside of the Western Balkans. I could probably count on the fingers of my one hand how many people know anything who could talk for more than 1 minute on Macedonia in Britain. It's just really... And yet, we see the situation, but to a policymaker who's stressed with a lot of different things on their plate, you've got to have a ministerial sign-off on this. They just look at Macedonia, they think, isn't there a problem between the Macedonians and Albanians? If we do anything, if we let this get out of hand, then there's going to be ethnic conflict. And so, you know what, let's step in, let's dampen things down. And I think that is part of the problem that we have to consider. The amount of attention span that outsiders have to this, and the way that they see the problem is very much set in the past. And there is a real sense of elevating stability, first and foremost, even if that sense of stability is perhaps misplaced, that there are other problems in Macedonia which aren't going to lead to ethnic conflict, but that's how they see it, that's how they respond to it, that's how they try and dampen things down, and not let some of that sort of popular anger at what's happening with the government overflow, and maybe that's what is really needed in many people's eyes.
Maciek, would you agree? Because when I spoke to some Macedonians last night, they were highly critical of the EU in not pushing forward. It was kind of damage limitation and letting Skopje off the hook. I mean, do you agree with James's assessment that it's you go in to limit the damage, or just don't let things really change?
Do more than that, but more broadly on the enlargement process. I mean, it goes on. I mean, we have obligations. We have a set dynamics. Okay, the guidance of President Juncker was clear that no enlargement will take place until the end of this mandate, which is 3 years from now. But nobody has told us to stop. That's why we go on. I mean, it's a bureaucratic process, opening, closing chapters. I've done it all in my previous life. When you don't have a clear end date, it's a bit more challenging to keep the spirit, but it's possible. And hence we're really attached to the fundamental principles, like the judiciary, like the rule of law, and there will be no let up. I mean, this is not going to change.
Sina, briefly come in, and then Alida, if you want to pick up Maciek, please.
I want to ask an uncomfortable question after having listened to all of this. Is democracy good for institutions? Think about for a moment. Now, what I can say is that liberal democracy is good for institutions. But is democracy good for institutions? If you have a form of democracy that's essentially just a ballot box democracy, that is about majority rule, that is about concentration of power, and fundamentally usurps, abuses the institutions. So I think we should be more mature in our thinking as to what we mean by democracy when we say, will democracy survive global disorder? I think that should read, Sonia, will liberal democracy survive global disorder? Then, we have a case. But will democracy and institutions, there's a direct one-to-one relationship? That I leave it to you.
But you're also raising the question of the accountability of the institutions. Alida.
Actually, that we keep on forgetting one key word, and it's accountability, because certainly we don't want strong institutions in a traditional sense of strong institutions where we would actually put them hand in hand with repressive regimes. What you have in the Western Balkans more and more is mimicking exactly this repressive kind of regimes, if you will. At the same time, you want accountability, and you want these institutions to match what we would perceive as decent life, no more nor less. And this is why I think it's answering your question. This is exactly the word we should chip in when we try to answer it. It's accountability rather than anything else.
But if you pursue Sinan's argument, democracy, the liberal, isn't democracy, aren't there underpinnings of democracy? Values, human rights, rule of law, accountability. And can democracy be called democracy if it doesn't have those liberal components?
Yes. That's how we define democracy. Today, democracy is essentially a system where you have, elections, right? Now, to me, that's a shallow form of democracy. That's not liberal democracy. But that is still a model of democracy as opposed to other models of governance. And I think we should be a bit more nuanced in our thinking when we speak about democracy and spell out what we mean by democracy, because it's essentially, the liberal democracy where you have accountability, where you have the rule of law, that tends to be much more at par with building building of institutions, not the other one.
No, Shoko,
We started from a very low point of departure.
Who?
The whole world.
Oh, I see.
In the 80s, there was the legendary formula by Karl Popper: the essence of democracy is the possibility to change the government without violence. So whenever we have this, you are the prime minister and then I'm the prime minister, that would be called democracy if there would be not bloodshed or something else. That was the minimal level, that's what was said now, and that's accepted as democracy. And this is, of course, not enough. It has nothing to do with human rights, it's just a simple majority rule, as it was understood in the 19th century. There were no women with rights, there were no people of other let's say, skills or whatever. They were not accepted as members of the community, and we still thought, or they thought at that time, it was democracy. So we are now back in the 19th century concept of democracy. That's the problem.
But your concept of that earlier democracy, in some ways, it became inherently untenable and unstable.
Yeah, of course.
So the democracy that Sinan is suggesting, the democracy that's not liberal, it's not really sustainable, is it?
Well, it is.
Well, it could be.
It's killing less people than liberal democracy. After the war, it's my only criteria. You just count how many people were killed during the, let's say, Saddam Hussein's regime, and how many people were killed after the end of the regime. How many people were killed during the apartheid in South Africa? How many people were killed after the end of apartheid? How many people were killed in Yugoslavia in the last 40 years? 135,000 people were killed in the years after the end of Yugoslavia.
But if you take the case of South Africa, that wasn't a democracy, that was apartheid, and that was a kind of inherently based instability.
Yeah, but the idea was, the name of the game was introducing democracy.
After.
There was this,
Yes.
there was the Security Council decision to introduce democracy to South Africa in 1980, whatever, 4.
Well, let's just stand back and look at these terms. You mentioned the UN resolution to introduce democracy. You're implying that we're imposing this democracy.
Yeah.
No, I've had similar...
External, whatever.
External, it's role of external actors. Let me raise a point here about this whole definition of democracy. Say we broaden it out. And the West now has been criticized a great deal, whether it's by Russia, even by Hungary, for imposing its definition of democracy. However, part of this discussion, when they criticize the West, it's really criticizing the human rights of the West, arguing that human rights are not universal, that they are a Western product. But if this is the case, why do people across the world then strive for basic human rights, of the freedom of the press, of fair trials, of not being thrown into prison? I mean, these are the underpinnings of democracy. It comes, but we're discussing...
Very slowly, very slowly.
Look, it came very slowly in my country, for instance, and we were in the EU a long time. But I want to just pursue this element of the democracy seen on your... I'm not convinced that democracy without the liberal component is sustainable.
Well, look at the membership of the Council of Europe. What is the Council of Europe? I mean, the minimum norm of being a member of the Council of Europe is that you are a democracy. Now, let's be frank. How many of those countries do fall into the type of democracy that you tend to think is sustainable?
Well, fewer and fewer. And you can take the case of Azerbaijan.
I rest my case.
Yes. Well, then it should be reformed. Yes.
But I think there's this fundamental problem here that, you know, we expect good governance. Democracy should not be about political parties having the right to capture the state as a result of it. It's about, you know, it should be representative democracy, it should be inclusive democracy, it should be about allowing all citizens to be able to reach and you know, this is classical conservatism, if you like, but also tinged with, you know, classical liberalism, to actually sort of say it's about people to make the most out of their lives, to have that equality, to be able to push forward. It's not about making sure that you're just sorting jobs out for your supporters and that you're just going to allow a small clique of oligarchs to get rich. The other thing that really worries me is this other definition of democracy, again, which is emerging out of Brexit, which is this idea that popularist referendums are a more authentic form of democracy than representative democracy. That because 52% of the population voted for something based on lies, we have to accept that that really is, that's a good thing because that's democracy, rather than the fact that 70% of MPs, the people we elected to take these decisions, to think all day, every day about the big issues, and trust them to do it, that somehow now, no, that's not democracy. And I think, you know, we are seeing these conflicting, if you like, trends of democracy, which are forcing out these classical liberal democratic notions of parliamentary representation.
Maciek, do you want to pick up this point?
Yes, I mean, and also to come back to the notion of accountability. No, this 19th century is over. We may go back to certain forms of 19th century statehood, but the world has changed. People have changed. They are much more emancipated than they were, not least because they are interconnected. They have aspirations. That's why accountable government matters to them. And then, you know, we may criticize liberal democracy that's on decline, but people still want to live in that kind of environment. Otherwise, they wouldn't come to Europe.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. Alida, I want to go back to this element, especially in Serbia, this frustration, the sense of powerlessness among the younger elements of civil society, a sense of frustration, partly with the donor community, that they don't push hard enough, perhaps that they tolerate what the elites are doing. I mean, do you sense that democracy is not delivering here?
I think it's more complex than that, because what happened in the last 20 years in the Balkans is basically that we also in the process managed to grow out of our own hard work, if you will. So we do expect things to happen for us, which I think is the first killer factor for anything to actually happen. And this is why consolidation has failed within, because we have been waiting for a long time for the outside factors to actually contribute for something to happen. In terms of frustration, it seems that it just takes too long, that there is no point of being meaningfully engaged, and in the end that it's not being rewarded because the target is moving constantly and we don't know exactly where to hit and when, because this reward moves here and here and here, and it's never enough. I mean, we have seen throughout this period many examples, in Bosnia in particular, where international community hasn't been clear about its own goals and achievements, and it completely disturbed the image, I would say, of what we're actually striving for.
Can I just pick up on Alida's point on this? The international community hasn't been clear, and Maciek says, well, you know, the EU perhaps has been clear. It hasn't been clear on the direction, the future direction, for instance, of the Western Balkans?
It hasn't been clear. It hasn't had continuity and consistency that leads to loss of credibility, if you will. Because if you have a certain goal, then you pursue that goal equally for everyone. And this has not happened because there were favorites at times of the international community, or there were particular issues, there were different agenda setters that had nothing to do in the first place with the goal that we were striving for. And this has harmed, I would say, the process itself, and also disillusioned many in the process.
Ramsey, would you agree? Lack of continuity, lack of consistency? Or a different issue?
I think we are focusing rightly too much on the functioning of the institutions, but I think
it's important, though.
it will be good to broaden a bit the focus, the discussion, because the question is also how, not only how institutions are functioning, but how societies are functioning, and what threats democracy is facing in our region. And I think we have some internal threats and external threats that Sinan mentioned. I think we have the main threat towards our democracies is the advancing of illiberalism. And there are three illiberal threats which I think are very serious in our societies, in our countries. One is religious extremism, which we cannot escape and we cannot ignore. We have an animation of religious discourse in our societies, and we have recruitment of jihadists in some of the societies. Second, we have the populist moment, and the populists are doing better than liberals, and we have to ask the question, following what Sinan said, why people are attracted more by populists rather than by liberals. Yeah. And the third is what I call new nationalism, which is not, thanks God, the 19th century nationalism of territories, but is the 21st European nationalism, xenophobic, anti-Roma, anti-immigrant. It's not nationalism of fathers who fought the wars, but it's a nationalism of sons. And it's a nationalism mainly on the internet. I call it cyber nationalism. And all these threats, I think, which some are internal, some are external, and we are not surrounded by really very good models, starting from Erdogan model to Viktor Orban model, from Berlusconi model, which is very influential in some of our societies, to some other models. So the environment we live is more and more illiberal, and I think the institutions are placed in such environments, and I think we have to see it.
I want to pick up on this point in a minute. Tanos, you wanted to come in here.
First of all, James has my full sympathy because both our countries suffered from referenda in a different way, of course. Yes. Without discounting all the problems, I think self-flagellation can be useful, even necessary, but there's a limit. There is an element of relativity. One has to look at the progress achieved since the 1990s. And the Balkans have gone a long way. So yes, we should look into the problems and try to improve the situation, but don't forget what has been achieved. And I think the EU here has a number of carrots, I emphasize carrots, but a few sticks if necessary, to help the countries to improve their deficiencies. And also, Ramsey is right, there are a number of regional problems. What is missing is a regional cooperation and dialogue. And for example, I would blame my own country, which under the panic of the early stages of the refugee crisis, did not attempt to launch such a regional dialogue, bring all the Balkan countries together and try to find ways, maybe they weren't, but try to find ways to deal with the problem when everyone knew that sooner or later borders would be closed. And this is not a new problem, the lack of regional cooperation, because countries for many years felt that it's either regional cooperation or EU membership. It's not either or. You can have both. And I think there's still time and there's an urgency to do what other countries, the Visegrad, the Nordics, the 6 initial members of the EU, you have all kinds of groupings, and they sit together, try to find regional solutions. And I think we need to do that as quickly as possible.
And through clusters, perhaps, as well. Maciek, you wanted to come in here?
Just to react to Tom's point, because I agree. I mean, we are very much in favor of regional cooperation. We support it also financially. The only thing that cannot be done is to impose it. The countries have to get together and find a common purpose. You know, we've had so many schemes, for example, in Eastern Europe before enlargement. Some of them still exist under different names. But as long as countries felt that it was sort of imposed by someone, they were a bit lukewarm. Yeah. So the real revival of the Visegrad Group came basically after 2004, and even recently for some other reasons I would not like to comment on. So it has to grow organically, and but we will be more than happy to continue supporting them.
I want to broaden this out a little bit and give an historical perspective a little. The war is very recent in the Western Balkans. It's 1999 when it ended in Kosovo. That's a very short time. And I was wondering, it's not politically unstable, the institutions aren't very strong, but are we getting at something much more complex, sort of unfinished transformations, unfinished transitions? And I was wondering, it's all very well signing up to the acquis and joining the EU, but psychologically and politically and perhaps even intellectually, that even doesn't complete the transitions. I was wondering, Lidi, do you see this as an issue that it's still unfinished business here? Yes?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. The process of transformation, I mean, one could argue that, you know, it's halfway through, but I would say it hasn't even begun yet properly. And if you think about concrete steps of that transformation, they have been also halfway through done, because it doesn't seem to me that it ever was a truly systematic approach to it. What I wanted to mention, actually, when I was thinking about that, we're missing one really important point: economic independency of the Western Balkans. And why I'm mentioning economic independency is because resilience comes exactly from that source. If we're not independent economically, concessions concessions that we give for all sorts of, you know, to all non-European actors, but also other external actors, are really high. The price is really high because we're not able to do it ourselves. And I think it's really, really kind of super linked with democracy, with institutions. It attacks every single one of these things. Once you have your own stability, economic stability, you will actually go for pretty much anything. And this completely ruins the picture of transformation.
It's very hard, though, to see economic independency. Probably it's not an anachronism, it's just not possible anymore in the era of not even globalization, but even regionally. You all depend on each other. Maciek, you wanted to come in here?
Just to say that transition doesn't stop with accession to the European Union or any other organization for that matter, for a number of reasons. The last Polish transition period expired in May of this year. That was to grant foreigners the right to buy agricultural land. It was 12 years. But then the European law evolves. So it keeps on changing, and of course, if you're on the inside, you're part of the decision-making process, but it does mean it means that it still has an impact on the transition of your country.
What we're leaving out in this discussion is the first part of the title, addressing political instability and the institutions in Southeast Europe, including Turkey and Greece. Sinan, political instability, is it linked to weak institutions? Does one breed the other?
It is, but I think we should see it in a broader context because we cannot disassociate the social dynamics that we witness in our own countries from what's happening globally. And I think here, what we should be aware of is that, again, with the title of this panel, is that there is indeed political instability that we witnessed in many parts of the globe, even in the Western liberal system, essentially as a result of two dynamics that have combined forces to generate a large enough class of people that are now expressing their discontent with the current system. And those two undercurrents are globalization and technology. Now, what we see with Trump, what we see with Brexit, what we see also in Eastern Europe, is really this politics of discontent based on a large enough class of people that feel that they have been disempowered, that they have been disenfranchised, that the future is going to be worse than the past. And I think we should understand, as defenders of the liberal order, if these grievances stem from globalization, we're not going to roll back globalization. If they stem from technology and the fast advancements of technology, we're not going to unroll technology. So we have to be smarter about how we fix a system that has generated enough people, enough discontent, that is now creating the real challenge to democracy through what Ramsey was talking about, illiberalism, nationalism, and xenophobia.
Maciek again from Brussels.
Even in such a dynamically changing environment, we still need rules. We still need rules.
Oh, yes, yeah.
In a globalized world, with the new technological developments, we still need well-functioning courts, for example, the rule of law, the predictability in the business environment. So I think that needs to be upkept.
We have 15 minutes left, and I'm going to break some of the rules by just throwing out one or two sets of questions if anybody would like it. If you don't want to ask questions, you should say so now, but I think here's a great chance because it's quite an important debate. You've got to identify yourself and you make a very short question, one question, and address it to whom you like. Okay, 3 questions, one round of 3 questions. The lady behind you, and then, no, you're second. The lady behind you, I've forgotten your name. Yeah, okay. Microphone, please. Here. And then the lady on front with the green dress. It's very difficult to see, so you'll have to raise your hand if you want to. Oh, yeah, there's another. Okay, yes.
Well, my name is Jelica Minic,
Yes.
from the European Movement in
Yes.
Serbia. And Sinan finally came to the point. What is the relationship between social project, democracy, and good governance? You can have good governance without democracy.
Okay.
You can have democracy without social project. What is attractive for our countries in the European Union, it's the social project.
Yeah.
And European Union is now changing its social project. So I think that was the missing part of the debate.
Okay. Thank you.
We
That's
cannot
very important
only
question.
discuss democracy in very abstract
indeed.
way.
Thank you for this. You didn't come in. Please identify.
Hello, Sonja Stojanović-Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Nobody mentioned captured state.
Okay.
You talked about elites and international community, and I think Ramsey mentioned society. So I just wanted to know who is to deal with all the problems of post-truth politics and populism that you
Excellent.
addressed,
Thanks.
because elites are part of the problem.
Super question. And we have a third question over here. The gentleman there, please. If we could have a microphone over here. Yes, we did leave out those 2 important issues. Thank you, both of you.
Goran Boljevski, Open Society Foundations. Can you tell us what are the successful institutions that you see in the Balkans? Even successful institutions, example of successful institutions, even if they're institutions of authoritarian or dictatorial nature, but successful working institutions, not necessarily for the benefit of the population.
Is your question addressed at anybody?
No,
No?
whoever
Okay.
can pick.
So, terrific question. Social project, captured state, and the successful institutions. Who would like? Sinan, you had. I think it was directed at you. So
Yes.
try to keep it brief. Yeah.
At least some of the questions. I think we should start by recognizing that we need to do something to fix the global liberal order. So we have to move beyond a certain market fetishism that has been telling us, leave it to the market, everything will fix itself. We have to move beyond the pure outlook towards democracy saying, if we leave it to the democratic order, everything will fix itself. I think we need to start to think more constructively and creatively about how we are going to address these now very legitimate grievances. And there, yes, there is a problem because, if it's an elite project, then there is a problem with, whether we can rebuild the trust. But I think this is where leadership comes into being. This is where, nonetheless, even though there are, blemished actors, still the leadership of the West should take responsibility. And we should start to have a discussion about how we fix this. We should talk about the global tax regime. We should talk about the IPR regime. We should talk about the future of agricultural trade. We should talk about how to rebuild a more socially inclusive model. I think so we should really, but first we should move beyond the state of denial to a state of acceptance and a state of deliberation.
Yeah. We could discuss this at length. Thank you very much for the question. Captured state. James, captured state? I don't want to bring us into the British context, but still.
No. I mean, it's as I said, it is in fact a huge issue. I completely agree. I think that, as I said earlier, that I think one of the biggest problems that when we talk about democracy in this part of the world is this sort of sense of entitlement that political parties have, that because they've won an election, it means that they have the right to control every aspect of the state for their own particular benefits. And as I said, I mean, the very first comment that I made was that if there was one thing that I think needs to be changed is this, getting rid of these socially owned enterprises, because I think that this is absolutely disastrous for society. I know how people are attached to it in a very old context, thinking back to Yugoslavia, that this provided a social buffer and things. We've got to think, there's a bigger issue that Sinan's raised, which I completely agree with. We have got to consider our entire understanding of the economic system. But as a first step, certainly here in the Balkans, this problem of state capture, how can it be done to minimize? I don't know, though, how do you persuade political parties that it's virtuous to abandon a system which keeps them alive? Really, it's Macedonia, I think, again, I come back to this point, I think is on the verge of doing it, but every time it looks like it could be overthrown, we step in and stop it from happening. And are we actually doing the country a disservice by doing it? I know it's a very controversial point to make, but
it's very important, the role, again, that was brought up of the external actors on this too. In some ways, do they perpetuate this kind of captured state? And the gentleman over there, the successful institutions. Jarko and Alidi, briefly, successful institutions. How's your country doing?
The only successful institution I know are the fire brigades in Croatia.
Okay.
And half of them are volunteers.
There you go.
That's the only institution I really know that functions and gives people security.
Great answer, Jarko. Thank you.
Are amazing, but I mean this discussion has been ongoing for some time, and we have been, for example, pointing out, and Jarko can tell us whether this is true or not, an example of USKOK as one of the institutions that, in spite of everything, and I'm sure there are deficiencies to it, actually resists and delivers something that people recognize as a European project, I would say, or they recognize it as what we all strive for, which is, being European is basically having decent life. And this is maybe one example. In Bosnia, I don't know, like the most successful reform that we had was a defense reform, maybe Ministry of Defense, I don't know. There are certainly examples out there, but we would have to strip down to see exactly what this is about and why they're good at something or not. Again, I think this has a lot to do with rules and procedures and overarching structures, but again with the visionary approach, and sometimes it really comes down to an individual. We had an example in Bosnia of Directorate for the European Integrations that was really successful institution, led by a person who was really motivated to do that job. And it slipped down, and it bounced back, and it slipped down again, but it does has to do with phases, and I think we also have to sort of make our choices. What kind of democracy we want? Is it good governance that we're ready for at this stage, or we're aiming for something else like European ideas, or which level of democracy we will be content with at this stage?
It's a really important question, which brings up the issue of fairness, which we could touch on later. Tanis, you wanted to come in, and Tanis, Remzi, and Maciek.
I think security sector reform has been a success story in the Balkans. There has been extensive efforts. Now, is the system working perfectly? Obviously not. It's not like the UK, for example, although even there you can find criticism of the police. And if you look at the US, you have killings of black people and the death penalty and so on and so forth. So there's still much to be done, but this is work in progress. But one should not underestimate.
It's an important point. But you were getting some stability and security, which you wanted from the beginning. Remzi?
Very briefly,
Yes.
on Goran's question. I was thinking on the most successful institution in Albania, and I found it. It's almost a one-man show, People's Advocate, and the reason is that they all hate him. So, all politicians hate him, and this is why it's a very credible institution and people like him.
Oh, I see. Huh. Maciek?
Yeah, I was going to make the point about the security sector reform, and that it is an ongoing effort. When we widen the scope, we are now launching a major justice reform program in Albania, for example. And I would just add a product placement. If you want to read stories about successful and less successful institutions, you can read the next batch of enlargement reports that will be adopted by the Commission on the 9th of November.
I must say the enlargement reports have become actually very readable. Yeah. We have a very quick next round. Keep your questions very focused. 3 only. Yes, please. Microphone here. Any other question? Because I'm going to close it down in a few minutes.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hello, my name is Milena Lazarevic. I come from the European Policy Center Belgrade, CEP. Could anyone comment on the relationship or trade-off, depending on how you view it, between strong personalities and strong institutions? I have a feeling that in our region, it actually, in the end, all comes down to strong personalities, and that personalities are usually the biggest enemies of the strong institutions. And even Mr. Lani actually gave an example of a stronger institution, which is a one-man show.
Super.
So that may even confirm it. Thank you.
Wonderful. But we saw a huge amount of strong men. They were only men. Actually, Mrs. Milosevic was quite strong too in the 1980s. Strong leaders. Well, we see them in Turkey. We don't see them in Greece anymore. Sinan, I think this is yours, and maybe Shoko.
If I can venture a guess, I think strong personalities help in building institutions. Because in building institutions, you need to create the type of, social consensus where leadership skills matter. It's much more difficult to build institutions in an environment where there's no real leadership. But once you have those institutions, then strong personalities start to become an impediment to institutional rule. So I think it's not an easy relationship. It's not as if you can posit categorically that strong personalities is to the detriment of institutions. I think you should look at where you stand in terms of your institutional development. You can take advantage of strong personalities, but at some point, institutional rule should be more than strong personalities.
Sinan, first of all, I have to say something. I have to go. I'm very sorry, but time is running out. We started amazingly, absolutely on time, and I want to thank my stellar panel. You lived up to the reputation. To Maciek, to Tanis, to James, to Jacques, who we go back a very long time, to Alidi, to Sinan, and to Remzi, whom I finally met. And to his terrific audience, terrific panel, thank you very, very much, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Sonia, for inviting me. Thank you.